Everyone, I hope you can hear me. Buenos dias. Thank you very much for joining us. The topic of our talk today is an overview of the African avocado industry. The detail that was sent out for the webinar said that we'd be looking at emerging markets. I think something was lost in translation, but the topic for today's presentation is the African avocado industry overview. Maybe just a bit of background about myself. My name is Boyum, and I'm currently the General Manager for Westfalia Fruit Marketing in Africa. I started my career in avocados 18 years ago. I initially started studying avocados under Professor Volstenholm, doing a BSc in horticulture through the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. Maybe to give you a bit of background to what we'll be covering in this agenda. Firstly, we'll be looking at Africa in general. I'm trying to keep the presentation as simple as possible, thinking that there's people from many different parts of the industry that are listening in today. There may be researchers, there may be farmers, there may be students, and there may be growers. So we'll be covering a real overview of the African avocado industry, starting off with production areas. We will then look at nursery production, specifically in the context of South Africa. We will look at varieties, what we're growing in South Africa, and particularly new club varieties. Then a bit on fresh fruit sales and processing, some technical aspects around orchard management trends, and then moving on to sustainability and our activities in promotions. And then finally, for questions, I believe there'll be a facility that people can send through questions. I will try and find time at the end of the presentation to answer all of the questions at the end. Just in terms of South Africa, we're very proud to have hosted the first World Avocado Congress in South Africa in 1987. So we have a long history of growing avocados. And looking at the slide on the right here, you can see the founder of Hans Merensky, Dr. Hans Merensky, in an avocado orchard in the 1940s on Westfalia fruit estates. Starting off, we're going to have a look at a little bit of the detail on production areas through Africa. And this map shows that the avocado production is mainly focused on the eastern sides of Africa. So from the north, the production areas in the furthest north from Kenya, moving down into Tanzania, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and then South Africa. And the next few slides, we're going to be having a look at aspects of each of these particular production regions and where they fit into the supply calendar from Africa. So starting off with Mozambique, this is definitely Africa's newest production area. We only started our first exports from Mozambique in 2018. And the reason that there were investments put into this particular country is that it provides quite early production. Varieties picked in Mozambique matures in the late parts of January. In comparison to South Africa, we only reach picking maturity sometime in the late parts of February and only really in the main production areas in March. It's also a very early area for Hass in Mozambique. In fact, we're busy picking Hass there at the moment. Plantings are still quite young and new. There's about 500 hectares in the ground. And by our estimates, the industry is expanding by roughly 100 hectares per year. The main plantings are focused on Hass-type cultivars, and those include Carmen, which we'll talk about later in the presentation, which is an early maturing Hass-like variety, Maluma, which is a homegrown South African variety, and then of course Hass, which the world knows very well. Exports from Mozambique are focused on the South African domestic market, towards Europe and also to the Middle East. And all of the exports from Mozambique are currently handled by one single exporter. Moving on to South Africa, I think the general theme for South Africa is that the production is expanding and quite rapidly at the moment. In the 2018 season, we had an absolute record crop of 88,000 metric tons, and we pack mainly in 4 kilogram equivalents, so that's 22 million cartons. That volume is handled by 5 major exporters, and they're responsible for 92% of all the exports of avocados from South Africa. Our early production in South Africa starts in the north. in the lower lying hot production areas, and maturity develops later as you move south through the country and also as you move up the slopes into the higher altitude areas in the mountains. Our production at this stage is really expanding, especially into new areas that can extend our picking later in the season, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal and the Cape, which is in the south of the country. Our growers organisation, SAGA, estimates that the South African industry is currently sitting somewhere around 18,000 hectares. Hass types represent 62% of our total exports and greenskin roughly 38%. New plantings these days are much more focused on Hass type varieties. If you look at our industry maybe 20 years ago, you would have probably found that we were 70% greenskins and 30% Hass. Now that has switched right around due to market demands. The main markets that we focus on from South Africa are Europe, taking about 95% of our production, with a much smaller percentage focused on Russia, the Middle East and Southeast Asia. Just looking at the production, in terms of tonnages, you can see their figures going right back to 1970, with the earliest recording of avocado exports, up to 2018, where you see that massive peak going up to 88,000 metric tons. Just a word on 2017, if we look at the figures here, not a very big crop, and that was due to an extensive drought that we experienced in South Africa in the late parts of 2016. Our forecast for 2019 is that we will export over 60,000 metric tons, or roughly 16,000 4-kilogram equivalents if we look at cartons. Just moving on to Kenya. Kenya really is a maturing avocado industry. Initially, the industry was focused on Kuwaiti, mainly from smallholder growers, but there's definitely been a shift with a lot of top working of those Kuwaitis to Hass. Kakuzi, a well-known company in Kenya, has been the biggest commercial grower for many years, but the new large-scale entrants that have also started planting. So the face of the Kenyan avocado industry is maturing and definitely growing. The production season starts from February and extends right up to October, and that volume is shipped to the port of Mombasa in Kenya. And we estimate that the Kenyan crop sits somewhere between 50 and 80,000 metric tons. Of course, it's quite difficult to get official figures out of Kenya. Looking at Tanzania, which is just south of Kenya, here the plantings are mainly focused on Hass, but new plantings have also started in the north and Gem to extend the production season. The southern production areas, namely areas like Rungwe and Mbeya, have very early Hass supply, with some fruit being picked already in March, while the northern production regions, and there you can see a picture of Mount Kilimanjaro, is a bit of a later production zone with the Hass that matures somewhere between May and the late parts of August. We estimate that there's somewhere in the region of 700 hectares of commercial production in Tanzania. It's a rapidly expanding growing region, especially with smallholder plantings in the southern parts of the country. All the product from Kenya is shipped out of the port of Mombasa in Kenya. And the main markets for Tanzania are Europe. There's some shipments that also move into the Middle and the Far East. Looking at Zimbabwe, further south on the continent, almost the entire planting in Zimbabwe is focused on Hass. Their production season runs from mid-April to early August. Commercial plantings somewhere in the region of 1,000 hectares, and those plantings are based on a mix of clonal and seedling rootstocks. Most of those plantings are concentrated around a little town called Chipinge. It's in the eastern highlands of Zimbabwe, and it's an absolutely unbelievable climate for avocados. Some of the technical people who know the avocado growing regions in Africa very well call the Chipinge area avocado heaven. Europe is the main market for Zimbabwe, and 90% of the volume exported from Zimbabwe is handled by a single company. Looking at the seasonality, We've put together this table here just to show the different varieties on the left and various production regions. On the top, of course, you have the calendar months, just to give you an impression of the availability of the different varieties from all the different production regions. Maybe just picking on South Africa and looking at Faweti, we can see that the Faweti starts in the very earliest areas in the north, somewhere around mid-February, with production extending right up until the end of July. There are some growers in some areas that hang Faweti much later in the season, mainly for sales in the domestic market. But we find in terms of having good arrival qualities, especially in Europe, that we have a cut-off in most seasons somewhere around July, August, depending on the size of the crop. If we look at the main export variety from South Africa, being Hass, the production regions in the north of the country generally start picking in the late parts of March, with production that can extend well into October. And then just drawing your attention to the gem variety, one of the club cultivars. It really helps extend our production season. In terms of commercial exports of gem, the fruit's generally picked from the mid parts of September, and that picking extends right into November. However, gem hung late for the local market. We hung fruit right into February this year, picking fruit into the third week of February for supply into local retailers. Now that fruit had come from trees that flowered in August, September 2017 and hung all the way through to February 2019 when it was finally picked, and the fruit was of very good quality, so very good hanging potential. And then maybe just finally drawing your attention to the newest production area in South Africa, which is Mozambique, and there we can see a very concentrated short picking window with Faweti available in the late parts of January, and Hass with availability through March and extending into April, but early production zone. Moving into nursery production figures, maybe just to give you a little bit of feedback on what's happening in terms of nursery production in South Africa. Here we can see information that comes from the Avocado Nurserymen's Association. It's the latest data that they have on the nursery output from South Africa, and you can see the publication of this graph is from the 14th of February 2019. On the left axis here, you can see that we've got the number of trees sold, the avocado nursery trees, and the season in terms of the production runs from July to June. So we can see in terms of nursery sales from South Africa, we're fairly stagnant right through 2008 up to somewhere around 2014, ranging somewhere between 200,000 trees per year and 250,000 trees a year. And then production started climbing as the avocado market in Europe grew in value and grew in demand. And for the last production season, we can see the figure here recorded by ANA, the Nurserymen's Association, of 472,000 trees that were sold. If we look at the figures that are estimated here for the 2018-2019 season, so that will be all trees that are expected to be sold up to and including June 2019, we have quite an increase. So we can see that the nurseries have increased their production capacity, and the estimate there is 625,000 trees. However, this graph doesn't take into account all of the nurseries in South Africa, and there's one major nursery which is estimated to produce 200,000 trees in addition to the figures that we can see in this graph. So therefore, if we add another 200,000 trees to the production output for 2018-2019 season, we can see that that figure would be closer to 825,000 trees. There again, for the next production cycle, we'll have close to 1.2 million trees being produced by South African nurseries in the 2019-2020 season. So what does this mean to the industry? Well, you can see that the industry is definitely rapidly expanding. And if we consider that the average planting density is 400 trees per hectare, That's based on a standard spacing on Hass and 7 by 3.5 meters. Of course, there's some growers that plant a little bit higher density than this. There's also other growers that plant in lower densities, so this is a good average. And if we consider that nurseries will produce roughly 1 million clonal trees a year, this adds 2,500 hectares each year to production in South Africa. So we can see there's a real rapid increase in nursery production, and that will start becoming evident in our volume output from South Africa from 2020 and onwards. And just as a reminder, in the 2018 season, South Africa exported roughly 22 million cartons in 4 kilo equivalents. Looking at nursery production and just the spread between seedling and clonal rootstocks, this is very different to the South American situation, where most nurseries are producing a lot of seedling rootstocks with Hass grafted onto them. In South Africa, it's very different. And here we can see the blue is clonal rootstocks. And if we look at the percentage sold in the last season, we've got somewhere around 85% of the nursery output in clonal rootstocks. And a little bit later in this presentation, we're going to have a look at why the South African industry is very focused on using clonal rootstocks rather than seedling rootstocks. Moving on to varieties. In South Africa, we've got roughly 62% of our plantings focused on Hass-type varieties and 38% on greenskins. So if we look at Hass, that definitely includes the Hass variety itself, then Carmen, Maluma, Lamb Hass, and Gem. The greenskins include the Thaweti variety, Pinkerton, Edrenol, and Ryan. The main Hass type, of course, is Hass. Carmen is a club cultivar licensed from the University of Riverside, California to Westfalia fruit. It's an early maturing Hass type. It also tends to have a flora loca, or a crazy flower, which produces an out-of-season crop. And in South Africa, that out-of-season crop is quite important to us. It reduces our reliance on bringing in imports from Europe during our off-season. Maluma is a homegrown Hass-type variety that can be early in some areas. For example, there's an area close to Zanin called Maketsi, which is a very hot, low-lying area in the north of the country. And Maluma seems to tend better than Hass in the hot production areas, where Hass can be prone to producing very small fruit. Maluma's fruit size distribution in hotter growing climates seems to be better than Hass. And then, of course, we have Gem, also a variety licensed through Westfalia fruit by the University of Riverside in California. And it's a Hass-type variety, very beautiful ovoid fruit, and it can extend our production season quite dramatically. And there you can, on the right, you can see an example of some of the branded Gem packs of ripe and ready Gem sold in a UK supermarket. Just looking at the nursery tree sales output at the moment. So for the last season, you can see that the tree sales from South Africa, if we look at the cultivars, this purple here is Hass-type varieties, which will include the mix of varieties that we discussed on the previous graph. And if we look at the percentage of that coming out, definitely somewhere in the region of 75% of the trees that are being produced are the Hass-type varieties. If we move on to fresh sales and processing, this diagram just exhibits the flow of fruit from South Africa in particular. In terms of the green arrow shows fresh fruit sales into different target export destinations. And you can see that South Africa is heavily reliant on the European market, with around about 95% of our total export production focused on Europe. Russia accounts for roughly 1.5% of our fruit sales, mainly focused on smaller greenskin varieties. The Middle East currently represents around 2% of our total shipments. It is definitely a growing area of interest for us. and an area with growing demand. And then Southeast Asia, in the areas that we have open market access, and that would be Hong Kong, Singapore and Malaysia, would take approximately 1.5% of our total exports. The red arrows show our market access initiatives. So South Africa is really working hard on trying to gain market access into markets like China, India, Japan, South Korea, Thailand, and the USA. Also, maybe before we move off this chart, just to mention that the domestic market in South Africa is a very good market for us, absorbs a significant quantity of fruit, and it has different tiers in the market. It's quite a sophisticated market. We have an upper tier with ripe and ready offer that would parallel anything that you can find in Europe. And then we have a lower end of the market with bulk fruit sales. Looking at processing. Processing provides a very strong alternative to us for fresh sales. Processed product also counteracts some of the market barriers that we have on fresh fruit sales. So we can access certain markets with avocado products that wouldn't accept fresh fruit but can take processed product. So by removing factory grade fruit from the domestic market, we definitely lift the floor price of the value of the fruit in the South African market. We make quite a bit of guacamole from Hass using a high pressure pasteurization process. The growing avocado slice business through various businesses in South Africa is expanding. And in terms of oil production, you can see there in the top right of the slide some gourmet oils or food grade oil, which is part of the focus. And of course then oil is also made for cosmetic applications. Looking a little bit in terms of orchard management trends, just some technical aspects of production in Africa as well. Firstly, and coming back to why we're so intent in South Africa on producing clonal rootstocks. Well, in summer rainfall regions in southern Africa, we have soils with a very high clay content and sometimes restrictive layers that affect drainage. And in our soils here we have Phytophthora cinnamomi, and that causes root rot in avocados, and it's a real commercial issue in managing our orchards in southern Africa. And for that reason, we focused on breeding rootstocks that have tolerance or resistance to Phytophthora cinnamomi. And by producing clonal trees that have resistant rootstocks, we have orchards that have more uniformity, and that helps with irrigation and fertilization, and of course with productivity. And a lot of data has shown that on clonal rootstocks, on Dusa for example, we'd achieve at least a 20% better yield than we would from seedling rootstocks. An added benefit that we found with clonal rootstocks with test plantings throughout the world is that some rootstocks provide some tolerance to the trees, that they seem to do better growing in saline conditions than other rootstocks. Another aspect in terms of African production that's changed in recent years. I'll never forget visiting Chile with their avocado congress many years ago, and being quite amazed with the ridging that we saw in plantings in the La Serena area. And growers came back from that congress and had a look at our conditions in Africa, and we were battling with root rot. And we've adopted ridges in our plantings in South Africa. So a lot of the new plantings are going out in ridges that may be up to 1 meter high. And that has a lot of benefits in terms of removing physical soil limitations. It increases the permeability. We have better soil depth, better porosity, and soil dries out quicker after heavy rains. And of course there's a benefit there for having less Phytophthora root rot pressure. In terms of some other technical management of the orchards, we do quite a bit of pruning in Africa. In summer rainfall climates on high potential soils, we do battle to manage growth. Unlike Chile, with much sandier or rocky soil conditions in a slightly different climate, we can sometimes have 1.5 to 2 meters of growth flushes on Hass in African conditions. So we need to go in with a winter prune directly after harvest. We come again in spring after flowering with a small shaping prune, and we make use of growth regulators like uniconazole and paclobutazole. Looking at sustainability, sustainability is definitely a concept that progressive businesses need to embrace in the modern world. And if we look at where we've come from 15, 20 years ago with accreditations like Global Gap for dealing with supermarkets in Europe is definitely a minimum license to trade. And there's many other accreditations that come in around the pack houses, things like HACCP, BRC, on the ethical trading side of things to ensure that supermarkets have ethically sourced product, fair trade, and accreditations like CESA and SMETA are very important for our business. Carbon footprint is something that all of the farms are looking at in terms of reducing our carbon footprint and using water wisely. And lastly, moving on to promotions, South Africa and many other growers in Africa are proud members of the World Avocado Organization, and we pay a levy on every kilogram of avocados that we sell in Europe, 1.2 euro cents. That levy goes towards fueling demand for avocados in Europe by promoting the consumption through collectively funded marketing programs. Now, contributions into the World Avocado Organization are voluntary, and the organization was initially built focusing on the success of what the Hass Avocado Board has done for avocado sales in the United States. And the World Avocado Organization currently represents some of the world's largest avocado producers, exporters and importers. And member countries now include Mexico, Peru, Chile, the United States, South Africa, Mozambique, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, and Spain. We're very reliant on the growth of the European market. If you remember that 95% of our product is sold in the European Union and the UK. And here we can see the avocado sales in the USA compared to Europe, going back from 1995 all the way up to 2018. We can see here on this graph, if we look at 2017, the avocado market in Europe absorbed approximately 460,000 metric tons, and with a huge on-season from South Africa and Peru in particular in 2018, that jumped to 640,000 metric tons. So we're starting to catch up to the United States, and we hope that promotional campaigns driven by the World Avocado Organization will help to fuel that demand in the future for increased consumption of avocados. So that brings me to the end of this presentation. I'll have a look at any questions that have come through. And I see there's one question here in terms of what the advantages and disadvantages are of producing avocados in a hot climate. So if we look at what the market demand is these days, and most of the market worldwide is looking for the Hass variety. Well, in hotter production environments, generally we find that Hass matures earlier. However, Hass is quite prone to stress, and we find that Hass grown in hot early production environments tends to have smaller fruit. Now, the advantage of growing in an earlier area in Africa is that we can get fruit into a more lucrative production window in Europe. So if we look at the early northern areas, or for example, the new production areas in Mozambique, having that fruit move out into Europe and selling in the February, March, April window, if we look at the market values over the last few years, there's a definite premium in terms of the price for Hass avocados sold in the March-April window, rather than coming into the market in June, July, and sometimes August, when there's an abundance or surplus of supply available from South Africa and Peru, and increasing volumes also coming from areas such as Kenya, Tanzania, and Mexico into the European market in that period of the season. So that brings me to the end of this webinar session. Thank you very much for joining me. You can see my details there with my email address. If there's any questions that you have that you haven't managed to send through during this webinar, please forward them through WAC, that they can send them on to me, or you're welcome to make direct contact with me. So thank you for joining.